Hello, bonjour, salam alaikum. Welcome to the Climate.Culture.Peace conference, a collaborative initiative for knowledge exchange that aims to better understand the impacts of an intensifying climate crisis on the world's cultures and explore ways in which culture and heritage could be used for climate change mitigation and adaptation, helping to reduce the risk of weather-related disasters and build lasting peace. I'm Aparna Tandon, your host for this inaugural session. As a senior program leader at ICCROM, I lead the design and implementation of its flagship program FAR, First Aid and Resilience for Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis, which develops capacities for reducing the risk of disasters and conflicts for heritage and its associated communities. Climate Culture Peace is envisioned as part of the long-term strategic action of the FAR program, and it is strengthened by 55 partner institutions from 33 countries representing 6 sectors. This conference and its web portal are generously supported by the British Council's Culture Protection Fund in partnership with the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Our focus is on safeguarding the cultural and natural heritage of those communities that are on the front lines of the climate emergency, yet who have the knowledges and experiences to inform the global climate action. Further information on this initiative and our partners is available on the conference web platform. Over 160 contributors and nearly 1,200 participants have joined us from 110 countries. Despite the recent increase in COVID infections, from Sweden to Mozambique and Brazil to Vanuatu, partners, speakers, and attendees have joined us to express support for this vital exchange of knowledge and ideas. Therefore, in order to make this conference session widely accessible, this event will be streamed live on ICCROM's official YouTube channel and the Facebook page of Climate Culture Peace. This inaugural session will also be recorded in English, French, and Arabic and made available for replay on ICCROM's platforms. To begin our proceedings today, with great pleasure, I invite the Director General of ICCROM, Dr. Weber Ndoro, to take the floor and give a welcome address. Over to Dr. Weber Ndoro.
Thank you, Aparna. Your Excellencies, Honourable Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, I welcome you all from Harare. That's where I am, and I want to welcome you all to this very important Climate, Culture and Peace conference. The global climate changes poses a real threat to all humanity and its future. Science has been clear that human activities have largely led to effects such as warmer temperatures, strong and frequent storms, and severe droughts in many parts of the world. Science has also shown us that with concomitant action, we will reduce greenhouse emissions and mitigate the impact of the changes. It is also clear that the concomitant action requires that we act together. The coming together of world communities can be made possible through culture and heritage. This week, the Climate Culture Peace Program will explore the many intersections of climate change, culture and heritage, conflict and peace building, as well as disaster resilience. Climate Culture Peace is a knowledge-based initiative that underscores the crucial role culture and heritage play in shaping our perceptions as well as our responses to the climate crisis. The conference will also attempt to understand the impact of climate change on livelihoods and the lifeways of those communities who are at the forefront of this crisis. This project is conceived and designed by ICCROM's flagship program, FAR, First Aid and Resilience for Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis, which is aimed at protecting cultural heritage from conflicts and disasters. The British Council's Cultural Protection Fund, in partnership with the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sports, have generously supported this initiative. Building on the FAR program's worldwide network, this initiative has been strengthened by a consortium of 55 partners coming from 33 countries. While our partners tackle the issue of climate change in diverse fields, such as climate science, culture, education, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian aid, architecture, and engineering. They also fully acknowledge the idea of culture as the missing link for global climate action. As we all know, ICCROM was created after the Second World War in response to the widespread destruction and the urgent need to conserve cultural property. This, of course, has changed with time. Today, ICCROM, as an intergovernmental organization, seeks to improve the conservation of cultural heritage in all its forms throughout the world. Today, the challenges to the conservation of heritage are vast and different, if not more complex, than when ICCROM was initially formed. The notion of cultural heritage itself has already gone fundamental changes throughout the years. Now, cultural heritage is widely recognized as being crucial to humanity's well-being, as indicated in the UN's SDGs, which have been pronounced by the UN system. It plays a significant role in promoting harmony, social cohesion, and tolerance by its ability to build bridges between generations, communities, and nations. Therefore, efforts for its conservation must be integrated with our progress towards a sustainable future. Through the First Aid and Resilient Program, as well as other training research activities, ICCROM commits itself to building knowledge for better understanding of impacts of climate change on all forms of cultural heritage and associated communities, and development of culturally based solutions for a fair and inclusive action. Climate, culture, peace is a vital and important step forward in this direction. Culture and heritage are not and cannot be bystanders in a global action on climate change. Rather, they are and must be essential parts of all that we do. Through this initiative, we would like to reach out to all regions where climate-related stress are being witnessed. I'm glad to know that we have participants from the Middle East, from Europe, from Africa, from South America, and Asia, just to mention some of the regions which are being represented here. Paradoxically, all the regions of the world have a wealth of cultural knowledge which can be capitalized to find solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Therefore, I hope that the conference will gather and share inspirational stories, experiences, and knowledge to inform future actions. I would also like to thank all knowledge holders, policy advisors, practitioners, as well as community and youth leaders who have come together to contribute to this initiative. To the distinguished speakers of our inaugural panel who have generously joined us to kick off this event, I extend a warm welcome, particularly to the Honourable Minister, Mr. Sam Kofe, Minister of Justice, Communication and Foreign Affairs, Tuvalu, to the Goodwill Ambassador, Her Royal Highness Princess Dana Firas from Jordan, to my friend, His Excellency, Mr. Ernesto Ottone, the Assistant Director General for Culture at UNESCO, to Professor Alexandra, the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, to Tim Badman, Head of Heritage, Culture and Youth at IUCN, and to Dr. Mwangola, a performance scholar and member of the Executive Committee of the Council of the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. I thank you all for joining us in this initiative, which aims to build knowledge and develop a common agenda for culture action. In conclusion, allow me to invoke the words of the Nobel laureate and environmentalist from Kenya, Dr. Wangari Maathai. Open quote, "We today are faced with a challenge that calls for a shift in our thinking so that humanity stops threatening its self-support system. We are called to assist the earth to heal her wounds and in the process heal our own. Indeed, to embrace the whole of creation in all its diversity, beauty, and wonder," close quote. I therefore also want to thank you all for coming to this conference and wish you all a successful conference. Thank you. Shukran.
Thank you, Dr. Ndoro, for sharing these inspiring words and highlighting the need for integrating heritage into global climate action. Resonating strongly with this message, up next is the performance by Dr. Mshaï Mwangola. Titled Invocation, this performance will use prose and poetry to offer pathways for climate action that draw on the work of visionary women leaders of Kenya, rooted in their cultures and ancestral knowledge. Dr. Mshaï is a Kenyan storyteller and peace-building scholar. She will be making this performance with Mr. George Babu Acheng. Over to Dr. Mshaï Mwangola.
Invocation. 1. We walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, remembering in this space, amongst others, our foremother, Wangari Maathai, who charged us to do the best we can. There's a beautiful story that I'm sure many here know that she told of a little hummingbird who, in the face of crisis, refused to be discouraged by what appeared to be insurmountable challenges. She brought the story to a close, saying, "We should always be like a hummingbird. I may be insignificant, but I certainly don't want to be like the animals watching the planet go down the drain. I will be a hummingbird. I will do the best I can." These are the days that must happen to you if you can stand to see humans in this landscape make ephemera of their earthly inheritance, and then wonder, wage war, foster joy, scout a self. currently in Nairobi, the ancestral home of the Mshaï, and we invite you to join us on a journey, well, part of it anyway, to loiter, a part of the greater Serengeti ecosystem, about 150-mile drive southwest from here, where we have a chance to experience the world from a fresh perspective, an ancient and timeless one. And so we are joining a hike sanctioned by Maasai leader Mokompo Olesimel, also known as the Oloibon Kitok. As Oloibon Kitok, the highest ranking Oloibon, he is the spiritual leader of more than 1 million Maasai who live in Kenya and Tanzania. He sits between worlds as mediator, prophet, and seer, as intercessor and healer, as cultural liturgist and political strategist, and as keeper of good relations between humanity and nature. When we arrived at the summit where our hike would start, 3 junior elders were waiting for us. The scouts were stately Warilen, watchful and taciturn, except for the gregarious Lagutut Olympia. Our guides explained that as the crow flies, our waterfall was roughly 5 miles away, which would mean a 5-hour walk through a cascade of marshes. As we began hopscotching among boggy reed islands, I amused myself, thinking about how the terrain reminded me of the dead marshes in The Lord of the Rings, the J.R.R. Tolkien described as an endless pool or network of pools and soft mires and winding, half-strangled watercourses. But after our third marsh passage, the novelty of imagining this as a Middle Earth journey deteriorated into resigning slogging. Our shoes were slathered in mud. Our pant legs were soaked. Staying dry wasn't an option. Water was everywhere. Streams popped out of the ground like gin, while others stuttered and evaporated mid-flow. Water leaked from rocks or dropped as a long single thread from high outcrops. All of it made its way into what appeared to be a swamp, but was really a meandering river, the Olasu. We traced its growth as it widened and deepened. The guides told us it hosted fish, hippos, and disturbingly, and then it disappeared into the forest through a tunnel of overgrowth. As we crawled through the dense thickets, though we couldn't see it, the sounds of its current became our beacon to follow. After a while, we staggered into a spot the Maasai call the place of boiling waters. Slowly bubbling warm puddles fed by geothermal springs. Chilled. I wanted to linger. Up and down we went, slipping down a pathway of scree, pulling on vines to climb steep hillsides, then tumbling down guardrails, only to crawl up another hill. We squeezed past giant moth-covered boulders, pushed through enormous spiderwebs, became overly familiar with stinging nettles and rednecks, and learned to sidestep places in the guides' presence. I did, however, manage to step in the double road. Lagutut was unperturbed by all of this. He noticed everything. He pointed out the shape of trees, the texture of leaves, the pattern of lichen on rock, the position of a fallen tree, breaks in branches, scratches on bark. He paused over myriad kinds of down and indicated what creature had left them. He talked about the flight paths of insects and birds, the intensity and temperature of the wind, the texture of the light that comes through the canopy, the scent of wind, the breathing of floods, the movement of silence. As I walked, my concentration began to narrow down to what was in front of me. How the soil changed from dark brown to bright red, and then almost black, and then sand and loam, and then orange and black, to dark pale and brown. I began to see patterns in leaves and shadows. We encountered several swarms of bees. This is also called the honey forest, Language said, noting the abundance of flowering bushes. He pointed to a grove he identified as nursery trees. Trees grow in families, he said. Older trees guide and nurture young trees. They share friendships among themselves and with people. He described the practical, medicinal, and spiritual power of some of the trees, the oreteti, podo, wild olive, and date palm. As we had, he mentioned other secret spaces within the forest, caverns that held pure streams and art inscribed on its walls. He talked about a cathedral of giant trees where the Honourable conducts the most private ceremonies. I learned elemental nouns. Ewawan, light. Oloi, shadow. My ears filled with bird song. The whistle and of insects and other creatures. The rhythm of raindrops hitting leaves. My nose filled with scents of pungent earth. Rot. Noted a hornbill. Monkey. And a change in timbre. Colorless monkeys. Crow, crow, crow. These were rain signals. We picked up our heavy steps. Finally, we emerged over a vertiginous valley lined with cliffs of brown stone flecked with white, blue, white, and green. Pale yellow butterflies quivered around us, signaling the end of the rainy season. A large bird of prey circled below us. At last was the waterfall. The Ola stood, tumbling from a rock tunnel, falling some 600 feet into a chasm beneath the foliage. Further on, Lagutut said, it would join the Onyogototo River and left to its natural course would end up in Lake Natural. But we did not stay. We had to make our way back through the forest before nightfall, before mist obscured the marshes. And as we trekked out of the forest, I learned another Mao word when we glimpsed the fullest, biggest, and brightest of moons. Olapa. When we reached the guest house, the Oloibon had left word. He would speak with me in the morning. A brown-feathered cockerel carried a locust in its beak as instructed in the Oloibon's compound. Cows and goats ambled off to pasture with the young virgin, still bringing with the experiences from the forest. The giant of the 30 tree. eyes lit up when he saw me. I can't deny that I felt his aura. Call it pure charisma. Or possibly the effect of all the legends I heard mixed with the wonder of the previous day's journey. Perhaps it was the joy of stumbling upon a leader with an unwavering allegiance to the natural world. I saw a symmetry between the Oloibon and his Oreteti, both grounded, ancient, mysterious, both offering shade and shelter to those who seek them out. Our conversations meandered like the honesty. He referred to the lineage of his predecessors and his progeny. He described what it meant to be the Oloibon Kitok. It was not a choice. He was born into his position. He spoke of his forest. It is a shrine and cathedral, a refuge and fuel source. It's the garden of God, the guest house of rain. It is school, supermarket, hospital, pharmacy, and nursing home. You are perfect. Pride, lust, and envy in particular. The Oloibon told of wave after wave of incursions by outsiders, shady government officials, four preachers, and eager developers. They all spoke in subtle but deadly terms. Fences, demarcation, title deeds, backlots, roads through the forest. He alluded to ceaseless plots, particularly from deep-pocketed international conservation groups that purported to tell the people the Eloi time what was best for Loita. He spoke about the importance of it. If we lose the land, we lose the culture.
Lose the
culture,
lose the peace.
lose the peace,
Lose the community.
lose the community,
Lose our way
of life.
forever.
He sat in silence. I saw an elderly atlas holding up not just the heavens, but also a weaver bird. The Oloibon looked in its direction. Tranquility settled over. I shook my What did it say? Instead, I turned the conversation to the changing climate. I've heard such things, he said. Have you seen the seasons change here? The cold hits harder and harder, and more often it's true. What about drought? He frowned. Just once, 5 years ago. But that was the consequence of our misdeeds. We had raised fences. We fixed that error. Do you have a message for humanity that is confused by this changing climate? No pause. What can I say? He finally answered with a humorous smile. As temporary guests of this home called life, in this house that is the earth, shouldn't we know by now how to behave honorably? For the Mshaï, he explained, this meant adhering to all manyara. It's a difficult term to explain. But on a previous night around a campfire, my friend Morris described all manyara as an ethos that is less about conservation and more about custodianship. It's about receptivity to nature, of being aware of and hospitable to existence in its every form. From the rumble in the distance, it's raining in the mountain, a prelude for the primordial and animal migrations to resume. Are you ever afraid of the future? I asked. Should I be? He teased. Quickly, the elder swerved, and I was a student again. Now you've been to our forest. What did you see? My ignorance. I had thought of the forest as only trees. The Honourable laughed. It was a mirthful sound. It made everyone laugh too. What else did you see? These are the days that must happen to you if you can stand to see humans in this landscape like ephemera of their earthly inheritance, and then wonder, wage war, foster joy, sculpt a self. I may feel insignificant, but I refuse to watch the planet go down the drain. I will be a hummingbird. I will do the best I can. Three. The land. The air is not what it used to be. It carries the smell of trees we plant, cars we drive, food we smell, we eat. Those who remember also smell the absence of trees and shrubs. Our hearts have changed. They are soft in places our mothers could not have imagined for us. But no longer do we feed and parent our neighbors' children. Some of us neglect our own. Questions will be asked. Were our ancestors? What do we know better? What have we let each other forget? Our mothers walk with the birds to feed and clean and teach endurance and duty in bouts of song and silence. Children were their life, their wealth, their wealth. Who are our ancestors? What do we know better? What have we let each other forget? It's the future. To have a child who knows her name, the story of his mother and grandmother, a child who knows his father and grandfather, the families from which she came, the paths they trod, what Kisumu, Meru, and Marakwet were like back then, every place, the thorns and blossoms. It's the future I want, to clothe and protect, to fatten like the goats in which I put my hope. I shall wrap it in stories told with words, in pictures, in song, in dance. What is past and what is present shall together be a muse for my offspring. I shall be a muse for my offspring. They shall need no other. Like those who have gone before. I shall sometimes lie to cover up my misdeeds, but not too well. My children shall know who I have been. They shall know the names of the trees God gave this land. They shall grow. They shall play the music we falter to remember. They shall have the wisdom we make now. And that which we have neglected to learn. We shall teach it to the world. One way or another. These are the days that must happen to you if you will be a hummingbird.
I thank Dr. Mwangola and Mr. Cheng for this moving performance, reminding us that heritage cannot be reduced to places, buildings, and artifacts. It lives on in form of practices and performances that we bring from the past into the present to shape our future, which for now all of us includes a warming planet. And global warming is also putting low-lying island states at greatest risk for increasingly powerful storms and rising oceans. The threat is imminent, and in response, some of the most affected countries are making preparations to resettle their people within the next decades. One such island country is Tuvalu, located in the South Pacific, which is planning to transform itself into a digital nation. What role could culture and heritage play in a future where land would no longer exist? I have the pleasure and honor to introduce a leader who has a unique vision, Honourable Minister Simon Kofe, the Minister for Justice, Communication and Foreign Affairs for Tuvalu, who sent us this recorded message, and which is really inspiring. Let's watch.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to speak to you today and share Tuvalu's experience strengthening culture and values, especially in the face of the dire threats posed by climate change and sea level rise. As you may know, Tuvalu is a low-lying atoll nation located in the Central Pacific. It is the third smallest independent country in the world, comprising 9 widely separated inhabited islands and a population of around 12,000, half of which lives on the main island of Funafuti. Tuvalu also possesses a unique cultural heritage centered on community and communal action. I am a staunch advocate for the importance of Tuvaluan culture and values to all aspects of modern Tuvaluan life. In my role as Minister for Justice, Communications and Foreign Affairs for the Government of Tuvalu, I have ensured that culture is reflected in our 2020 foreign policy, our forthcoming ICT policy, and even in the ongoing review of Tuvalu's constitution. Tuvaluan values of communal living systems, or olanga whakawhenua, shared responsibilities, or kaitasi, and being a good neighbor, or falepili, are critical to Tuvaluan ways of life and the consensus culture that has guided our nation for centuries. But these values are not only critical to Tuvalu, they are also critical to our global community. In today's increasingly interconnected world, it is my strong belief that Tuvaluan culture and values can enhance our global relationships. A Tuvaluan values-based approach to international relations emphasizes the global well-being of present and future generations and the responsibility of individual states to achieve this well-being. However, our Tuvaluan culture is increasingly threatened by the impacts of climate change. As sea levels rise around our island home, scientists predict that our low-lying land territory could be completely submerged before the next century. What would happen to our Tuvaluan culture and values then? Are we expected to watch them disappear along with our land? Of course, my answer is a resounding no, and my government has adopted a values-based approach to fight the very impacts of climate change threatening our cultural heritage. Last year, Tuvalu launched the Future Now project. The project now includes 4 initiatives to combat the effects of climate change that seek to both preserve our Tuvaluan culture and utilize our unique cultural values to stop climate change in its tracks. The first initiative under the Future Now project promotes the ethical and moral principles reflected in Tuvaluan cultural values, so that these values will influence other nations and peoples. Utilizing values-based diplomacy, we motivate others to recognize Tuvalu's communal way of living and understand the shared responsibilities of all countries to address international issues like climate change and sea level rise to achieve global well-being. Under the second and third initiatives in the project, we strive to maintain our maritime boundaries and statehood as permanent, even if Tuvalu's land territory is submerged due to sea level rise. We also look to create a digital nation that can preserve our government administrative systems, our state, and our cultural heritage in the digital space. I believe what is innovative about our approach in initiatives 1 to 3 is that we are not only working to preserve our culture and heritage, given the severe threats posed by sea level rise to Tuvalu, but we also see that culture and heritage have real values as tools to combat climate change. We see our culture not merely as something that is threatened by rising seas, but as something that can persuade other countries to reduce their contribution to sea level rise. The final and newest initiative under the Future Now project is initiative number 4, which outlines our efforts to undertake a more strategic, consistent and coordinated approach toward advocacy on climate change and sea level rise, both in Tuvalu and throughout the Blue Pacific region. To make a real difference in the fight against climate change, we must work together as a nation and as a Pacific region to advocate for our unique cultural values and ways of life. We have to be tireless and push for our voices to be heard at venues like this one to ensure that our nations, our lands, and our cultures survive the climate threat. Tuvalu is preparing today to secure our future tomorrow, and we're using our culture to do this. Our culture motivates us to care about and fight for the global well-being, and it reminds us that all citizens of this earth must do the same for Tuvalu and all Pacific Island nations and small island developing states. Our culture teaches us that we have a shared responsibility to care for and protect others, and we hope it can teach leaders and citizens from throughout the world that they too have a shared responsibility to stop the effects of climate change before we all feel its devastating impacts. Although I'm only present here virtually today, I would like to strongly commend the organizers for hosting this meeting. I urge all participants to take advantage of this opportunity to dialogue and wish you all the best in your deliberations over the next 5 days. Faftailasi Tuvalu Moderatua.
Thank you, Honourable Minister Simon Kofe, for making us realize and understand how culture and heritage are crucial in promoting a shared sense of responsibility for tackling the climate crisis and ensuring global well-being. To discuss this idea further, coming up is a keynote panel of distinguished leaders, policy advisors, and scientists. And to moderate this panel, I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Marcy Rockman, the Scientific Coordinator of Climate.Culture.Peace initiative. Marcy is an archaeologist based in Washington, D.C., who has worked with U.S. National Park Service as their lead for cultural heritage and climate change. Over to Marcy.
Thank you so much, Aparna. To Dr. Ndoro, Dr. Mwangola, to Minister Kofe, to our distinguished panel to come, and to everyone attending, I'm really honored to be here. For our first keynote panel, I would like to introduce Her Royal Highness, Princess Donna Firas, UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador and Chairperson of the Petra National Trust. Her Royal Highness has supplied us with a recorded message. If we could play that to start.
is one of the driest countries in the world. Water scarcity, which undoubtedly is exacerbated by climate change, is impacting every aspect of our life and is currently the greatest threat to our future. We know how devastating climate change is for many of us, particularly vulnerable communities. We also know that cultural heritage will be heavily impacted. Why is this important? It is important because cultural heritage is a critical sector for development, employment, creativity, identity, social cohesion, and peace building. But equally important, cultural heritage plays a critical role in building people's resilience and their capacity to adapt, innovate, and survive. In recent years, we have witnessed significant loss and often irreversible damage to cultural heritage sites and artifacts as a result of climate-induced fires, winds, erosion, sea level rise, droughts, and changes in precipitation, flooding, and extreme weather phenomena. And only recently, UNESCO issued a scientific assessment that detailed the role forests in World Heritage Sites play to mitigate climate change by absorbing 190 million tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere each year. But what was alarming was the finding that 10 forests released more carbon than they sequestered because of pressure from human activity and climate change. In Jordan, rising temperatures caused damage to fragile rock structures, particularly sandstone, and we see evidence of cracks and rock instability affecting the magnificent monuments of Petra, for example. Increased evaporation alters humidity levels and impacts Qusayr Amra, Petra, and the churches of northern Jordan, where murals and wall paintings will suffer from corrosion, mold, and salt damage. Intangible cultural heritage suffers major damage and loss with the effects of climate change as well. The decline and disappearance of vegetation, plant and animal species changes important cultural practices, traditions, passed down culinary skills, use of medicinal herbs, and precipitates the loss of food security. Climate-induced damage results in a change in people's relationship with each other, with the land, and with the places they identify with. This produces an evolution in the sense of identity and values, and the loss of traditional stories, rituals, and traditions that are no longer set in an identifiable cultural landscape. Ultimately, climate change will impact people's lives, livelihoods, and their way of life, reshaping economies, landscapes, and communities. To survive, people, particularly those most vulnerable, must build resilience. And the key to resilience are culture and heritage. Culture-based strategies build on traditional systems of social cohesion and communal strength to enable people to cope with stress and change. They focus on inherited values of trust, social networks, and place attachment, all critical to how communities come together and survive in times of challenge. Culture-based strategies emphasize important but often unrecognized local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge, traditional technologies, including techniques and innovation through practice and adaptation. They acknowledge resource-based livelihoods, traditional use of the land and sea for subsistence, and sustainable management approaches. The ancient hydrological systems of the Nabateans, for example, hold invaluable lessons for Jordan and other poor communities, water-poor communities, to inform our approaches to water harvesting, collection, distribution, and use. And there is much to be learned from traditional building practices, the use of materials, agricultural techniques, and much, much more. Culture-based strategies honor diversity, and incorporate unique and differing worldviews and belief systems, languages, and values. Culture provides both the capacity for dialogue and exchange, which fosters interconnectedness, and also emphasizes adaptive learning, including the role of creativity and inspiration in adaptation and innovation. We anticipate the need for urgent, rapid, and far-reaching measures. We know that change is difficult, disruptive, and often unfair. Culture embodies within it an intangible quality that remains critical for human well-being and peace of mind. It is a celebration of beauty, of history, of human connection. It defines our national identity and what is important to us. It expresses our national character. And in our collective efforts to begin the process of evolution and transformation in our production and consumption patterns, in our lifestyles, our national character matters. It will be the glue that holds together our communities and the necessary reminder that we are doing this for all of us and for generations to come. There is a need to have not only a conversation about climate with culture colleagues, but also a conversation about culture with our climate colleagues. And there has been much progress in recent years at many levels. The Climate Heritage Network, for example, is working to mainstream culture and heritage into international climate policy and science, both to improve the effectiveness of climate policy and to create frameworks, entry points, and better practices for culture-based climate action. The inclusion of the network in September 2021 in the Race to Resilience initiative was a turning point for mainstreaming culture into climate action. The first time culture and heritage were included in a major UN climate campaign. And there are numerous examples of significant action being taken to build resilience of communities at the very local level as well. The International National Trusts Organization, for example, supports efforts to protect cultural heritage sites and communities living in and around them, and to build their resilience and ability to adapt, mitigate, and ultimately survive the devastation of climate change. In addition, many international organizations are doing cutting-edge science and global advocacy to incorporate culture and heritage in the climate agenda. UNESCO's work is a wonderful example, as well as that of its advisory bodies, ICCROM, ICCOMOS, and IUCN. Today, this work is more important than ever. Our collective work is more important than ever. We must work together to amplify the voices of culture and heritage in climate action. We must prioritize culture-based strategies in our global efforts to find solutions and implement mitigation and adaptation measures. We must find the financing to set up a global cultural adaptation fund to protect and preserve our cultural heritage in the most vulnerable places. And we must do whatever it takes to make vulnerable communities more resilient to climate change. I would like to say thank you to ICCROM for this invitation, and to Aparna and Dr. Marcy Rockman and everyone involved in organizing this initiative. We are also very grateful to the British Council and the Cultural Protection Fund for their continued support, and to all partners of the Climate.Culture.Peace Consortium. I do apologize for not being able to be with you in person, and I hope to join the question and answer session, but it was for commitments that were beyond my control. I wish you all the best in your deliberations, and I look forward to joining you soon. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Your Royal Highness. And we do hope you will be able to join for the question and answer session in just a bit. Next, I would like to introduce the Honourable Mr. Ernesto Ottone, Assistant Director General for Culture at UNESCO. Mr. Ottone, welcome. Please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Marcy. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, first of all, let me tell you that it is our pleasure to be today with you for this inaugural session of the Climate.Culture.Peace initiative led by ICCROM, with support from the British Council Cultural Protection Fund. This initiative, which aims at illustrating the role that culture plays in understanding and responding to the global climate crisis, is very timely and comes in the wake of the recent UNESCO IPCC ICOMOS International Co-sponsored meeting on culture, heritage, and climate change, which took place early December last year, and represented an important milestone in our shared quest to ensure the full integration, as it was mentioned by Her Highness, of culture and heritage in the international climate agenda. You are all aware that climate change is the defining issue of our time. The alarm bell is ringing in every part of the globe, as we saw with Vanuatu, where culture and natural heritage sites are being threatened by bushfires, droughts, floods, and storms, which are increasing in both their frequency and intensity. The alarm bell is ringing as the rising seas could submerge Venice in Italy, Zanzibar in Tanzania, Rapa Nui in my country in Chile, or Luang Prabang in Laos, while encroaching deserts could bury iconic places such as Meroe in Sudan. The alarm bell is ringing due to the uprooting of communities caused by climate change, hence also threatening entire ways of life. This includes the practice and transmission of living heritage, oral tradition, performing arts, social practices, and festive events. The initiative launched today could therefore not be any more timely. Engaging culture in sustainable and resilient human responses to climate change is crucial and can no longer be delayed. Our collective actions for the protection of natural and cultural heritage impacted by climate change must be strengthened, especially in the most vulnerable countries and regions, such as small island developing states and in the African continent. And as you know, Africa has been one of UNESCO's priority for many years already and for the years to come. With this in mind, UNESCO, building on its distinctive mandate in the fields of culture, education, science, and communication, has been driving action to respond to this urgent challenge alongside its partner, including, of course, ICCROM, its member states, and all the stakeholders through a multidisciplinary approach. Building on strategy for climate action and the declaration of ethical principles in relation to climate change, as well as our sixth convention in the field of culture, UNESCO has long been working to safeguard the world's heritage from the effects of climate change, advancing the role of culture for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and its key role as a source of resilience. Culture is more than just an asset. It is also a fundamental resource to respond to the global crisis caused by climate change and the related loss of biodiversity. Culture contributes greatly to people's well-being, and it's instrumental in crafting a livable future, to take up the theme of today's event. A lot is to be learned from local and indigenous know-how, knowledge, and constructions, ensuring its transmission, protection, and promotion is therefore crucial. Safeguarding natural World Heritage Sites is also key. Forests and oceans serve as precious resources for capturing the carbon that humanity continues to produce in greater and greater amounts. On one hand, forests in the World Heritage Sites cover, as it was mentioned, 69 million hectares, roughly twice the size of an example, the Republic of Congo, for example. The 13 billion tons of carbon they store would, if released into the atmosphere as CO2, represent almost 1.3 times the global total annual CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. On the other hand, UNESCO World Heritage marine sites comprise at least 1/5 of blue carbon ecosystem and store carbon assets equivalent to about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yet these carbon sinks have limits. They are fast approaching saturation, as indicated by UNESCO's report on blue carbon and World Heritage Forest. Supporting countries in responding to climate-related disasters and their impact on heritage through capacity building is also a priority. For example, in view of building capacities for some of the most at-risk regions, UNESCO launched in December 2021 the initiative Strengthening Regional National Policies and Capacities in Preparing for and Responding to Climate-Induced Disaster Affecting Culture in the small island developing states and Africa, implemented in the framework of UNESCO's program on culture and emergencies, and contributing to key UNESCO strategies and priority, including the strategy for climate action, the SEEDS action plan, and the operational strategy for Priority Africa. The initiative will aim to identify specific needs as well as key challenges and opportunities in relation to current regional and national policy and institutional settings and technical capacities for preparing and responding to climate-induced disasters affecting culture. As many of you know, on the eve of the 52nd session of the IPCC in 2020, UNESCO launched a reflection group on culture and climate change. This reflection group allowed us to start a discussion with global experts from the fields of climate change, culture, and science on the role of culture and heritage as a key resource for climate change mitigation and adaptation. These collective efforts have led to the first ever meeting organized jointly by UNESCO, the IPCC, and ICCROM in December of last year, with the joint purpose of achieving a better acknowledgement and integration of culture in the international climate agenda. This meeting brought together over 120 scientists and experts from all regions of the world, mobilizing research, expertise, and insight from a wide range of disciplines, and aimed at establishing a scientific basis to integrate cultural dimension in climate action through three key areas: vulnerability and understanding risks, intangible cultural heritage, diverse knowledge system, and climate change, and the role of culture and natural heritage for climate action. The growing recognition of the role of culture for climate action at the G20 last year testifies to the effective impact of concentrated global action, which for the first time shone the spotlight on the need to address the climate crisis through culture. Progress has undeniably been made. However, enhanced data collection and strengthened synergies between culture and science will be required to fulfill the need for a comprehensive approach that can help reverse the effect of climate change, including by integrating the transversal role of culture. Addressing the impact of climate change on heritage requires defining tangible solutions for integrating culture and heritage into national climate policies and responses through multi-stakeholders collaboration and participatory process that engage local youth and indigenous communities. I am convinced that the outcome of this initiative and the related series of interactive workshops and the youth forum that are coming in the next days will greatly support the current momentum to demonstrate that culture is a key resource for climate action. Indeed, the knowledge generated through these exchanges will, without any doubt, bring us one step closer to the full recognition of culture in the global climate agenda, and closer to the adoption of integrated policy that take into account the fundamental role for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Before closing my my address, I would like to express that UNESCO's appreciation for our long-time partner, ICCROM, and especially his Director General, Mr. Weber Ndoro, for developing this initiative, as well as to the British Council's Cultural Protection Fund, in partnership with the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport for their support. I wish you all fruitful exchanges, and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ottone. I so appreciate all of your remarks and bringing all of those pieces together. Next, I would like to introduce Professor Alexandra Xanthaki, who is UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. Professor Xanthaki, welcome. Please begin your presentation.
Hello. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to contribute to this very topical debate. I have been asked to focus more on indigenous peoples and migration, and this is what I'm going to do. Of course, the impact of climate change is indeed harder on indigenous and marginalized communities, and we have heard from the previous honorable speakers how
وقد سمعنا من المتحدثين السابقين ما أشار إلى ذلك. في الواقع التغير المناخي يضرب الكثير من الأشخاص بشكل غير متناسب ويتسبب بتحديات كبيرة بالنسبة إلى السكان. هناك سؤال طرح علي إن كنا بحاجة إلى
I'm going to be maybe a bit controversial. I don't really think that we need new approaches. What we do need is to implement the approaches we have decided to go for. So I think that what we really need is to implement the international law standards that we, as the peoples of humanity, have agreed to implement. And human rights standards give a lot of directions when it comes to climate change. So they talk about non-discrimination. And we have to remember that all states have agreed to respect and implement specific measures to ensure the elimination of non-discrimination. In this fight for climate change, non-discrimination also means specific positive measures to be taken by governments. We have to remember that the states, although of course climate change needs assistance by all and international solidarity, the states do remain the main entities that are required from international human rights standards to take measures to ensure that human rights are respected. And in this respect, also cultural rights. So when we talk about non-discrimination, we also include special measures that the international standards of human rights do say that they're not only within the discretion of the states, but they need to be taken when the opportunities, when the circumstances warrant to do so. Another very big aspect is collective cultural rights. And we all need to agree that collective cultural rights are needed to be implemented. Communities have an amazing array of traditional knowledge relevant to climate change and adaptation and renewal. However, often their practices and experiences are only heard when they fit the national or prevailing development model. In my first report to the General Assembly, I will deal with the issue of development and cultural rights. And I will tackle this idea that development model is only the prevailing model that has been put forward. Indigenous communities and other groups put forward alternative development models that would have a very positive impact on climate change and we have to seriously take these models into account. These models are part of their cultural heritage and part of their cultural cosmotheories and views. In addition to collective rights, we also have to ensure participation of groups. So participation of indigenous peoples, participation of minorities and other groups in the fight on climate change. You see, I have the feeling that very often indigenous communities and other non-state groups are seen as the victims of climate change. And of course they are, but through their traditional knowledge, they can become excellent partners in the fight of climate change and the negative impacts from climate change. So we have already agreed that the indigenous peoples have free, prior and informed consent. They can give their free, prior and informed consent on all matters that affect them. And this is included in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I don't think that there is a different approach. I think it is the approach we have agreed to take, and now it is time to implement it. In implementing this approach, I would urge for the end of fragmentation. I heard some amazing initiatives that UNESCO, ICCROM and other organizations take. And every day I come across these amazing initiatives. Wouldn't it be time to all put our efforts together and to all interact and discuss how to best tackle the negative impact on climate change? I am really looking forward to contributing to the UNESCO Reflection Group with my mandate. The end of fragmentation among regimes of environmental law and human rights law is also of importance. Sometimes we have to be frank, sometimes environmental policies are in conflict with human rights policies and human rights standards. And the solutions are not easy, but these issues have to be discussed. We have to keep in mind that vulnerable groups must be given priority in the protection of the negative impacts of climate change. And we have to all agree that we will implement a human rights model, a human rights framework in the fight against the negative impact of climate change. So what about migration and climate change? In the report of the previous mandate holder on climate change and cultural rights in 2020, the issue of migration and cultural rights was discussed. The negative impacts of climate change, as you all know, force indigenous communities and other vulnerable groups to move internally or even, from one state to the other. And sometimes we view these as as voluntary relocation, but really they are forced relocations as well. They're also forced relocations because of projects that states take, sometimes with the funding of transnational corporations or even international organizations such as the World Bank and others. This means the loss of their culture and their identity, and this means that they lose the tools they have for survival and development of their culture. So, for example, the Sami are struggling to adapt to the impact that the climate change has on their traditional practices. And it is important to keep in mind that, of course, we are all affected by these, and there are a lot of groups that migrate. However, when we talk about indigenous communities, they do have a special link with their lands and the negative effects are even more dear for them. Does these forced relocations, do they constitute ethnocide? Yes, they do. And they go against the current standards of international law. So we have to put even more pressure on states to take specific measures to mitigate these negative consequences and to stop these relocations. Also, the nomads are affected. So, for example, pastoralists in sub-Saharan Africa, they are having their traditional way of life challenged, their nomadic traditional way of life challenged. Changing weather patterns and lack of resources disrupt traditional migration routes. I don't think that we have exhausted our means to reflect and come to solutions when it comes to migration and climate change. And even though states often agree that there is a link, they don't necessarily act on that link. So I think that this would be one of the recommendations that I would have. So very quickly, I think that it is important to recognize the indigenous peoples and their rights to culture and protect them with specific measures. I think that it is important that there is an end to the fragmentation of international bodies in the fight against the negative impacts of climate change. I think it is important that we all accept that there will be a human rights framework in our fight against the negative impact of climate change. And I think that climate change programs must be designed and implemented with the participation, the active participation, and at times the leadership of local populations and minorities and indigenous peoples. And finally, when it comes to migration, I think it is important to continue to develop a better understanding and recognition of the linkages between climate change and migration and displacement. So, for example, despite some states acknowledging the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, there are a lot of reluctance to acknowledge the link of climate changes as a driver for migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Xanthaki. We so appreciate you bringing all of those pieces together. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Tim Badman, who is Head of Culture, Heritage and Youth at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Mr. Badman, thank you so much for joining. Welcome. Please begin your presentation.
Many thanks. Your Royal Highness, Minister and Excellencies, Director General of ICCROM, colleagues and distinguished fellow panelists. May I first thank ICCROM for the very kind invitation to IUCN to speak at this event and pass on the greetings of the Director General of IUCN, who's asked me to make this presentation. As an organization that is focused on nature conservation, this invitation in itself recognizes that over the last decade, if not for even longer, IUCN and ICCROM, with our partners ICOMOS and UNESCO, have been on a journey that recognizes that nature and culture, that people and places, that heritage and ecosystems are completely intertwined and inseparable. It emphasizes that we can make a shift to see that the relationship of nature and cultures in all of their diversity needs to be part of the mainstream of how we think about the future of conservation and is key to achieving real sustainable development. This presentation is the first I'm making at a moment following the restructuring of IUCN and for the first time bringing into being a team that is focused on heritage, culture and youth, including a new urban initiative. And our partnerships with ICCROM have been crucial to making the case for this change. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to announce this new connection for the first time at an event with partners today. As I speak on climate, might I also acknowledge specifically the growing partnerships with ICCROM, ICOMOS, and our long and deep collaboration with UNESCO as I make these remarks. So to turn to, excuse me, if I can get the slides to work. So to turn to the topic I've been asked to address, here are IUCN's overall views and messages regarding the challenges of climate change. And so you can read these and see whether you think we have the seeds of a common narrative, a common analysis, and a common strategy. Climate change is not the only crisis the world is facing. IUCN is centrally concerned with the enormous losses we've been seeing to nature as a whole and to biodiversity, most dramatically with the extinction of species and the loss of the function of ecosystems and all the functions that nature provides to us as people, including its defining role in culture. But this extinction crisis and the climate crisis are deeply connected, and they're really two sides of the same coin. Even under the most ambitious implementation of the Paris Agreement, we will see and are already seeing losses of nature and losses of heritage due to climate change. This interlinked relationship between climate change and biodiversity loss and the loss of nature and all of its support to people was explicitly recognized for the first time at the UNFCCC COP26 held in Glasgow last year. It was also a key conclusion of the IUCN Congress in 2020, and it's leading to IUCN right now to establish a new Commission on Climate Change and a new climate team, also coming into being in the IUCN Secretariat. To draw a few messages of the challenge, the response that's needed to this challenge, it's vital that countries enhance their ambition to limit global warming to under 1.5 degrees centigrade. And this needs not only action through the climate convention, but it requires greater alignment and defragmentation of international processes as a whole to address climate change and biodiversity loss. It means mobilizing the finance needed to implement solutions, including nature-based solutions at large scale. And this is needing to be done in a way where environmental integrity and adequate environmental and social safeguards are part of the process. Thirdly, and finally, the implementation of a response to climate change has to be delivered by enhancing rights-based and gender-responsive approaches to climate change. Without justice, we will not get the solutions that we seek. I've been asked to review impacts of climate change on heritage, and I can tell that story if I turn to the World Heritage Sites, which we call natural sites. And since 2014, IUCN has produced the World Heritage Outlook every 3 years as a global assessment of all World Heritage Sites that are listed for their nature conservation values. So since 2014, with reports in 2017 and 2020. And the World Heritage Outlook is a global assessment of the potential that natural World Heritage Sites will conserve their World Heritage values over time. The World Heritage Outlook is a methodology which sees us assessing the values for which sites are recognized, the degree to which they are threatened, and the effectiveness of their protection and management to make an overall assessment of their outlook, which can be determined in one of 4 different categories, from critical to significant concern, to good with some concerns, or to a good outlook. And on that basis, we produce a flagship report as well as presenting all the site level reports on an interactive website. So amongst the many challenges the World Heritage Outlook tells us about, there is a stark story about the impacts of climate change. Since the, across the three reports I've mentioned, in 2017, we saw that climate change had become the fastest growing threat to natural World Heritage Sites. And in the last report launched in 2020, it is now the greatest single threat to all of our natural world heritage. The impacts are widespread and diverse. Different types of threats and impacts are facing different sites. We're seeing these impacts across all of the ecosystems that are recognized on the World Heritage List. And we're seeing impacts that are seen differently in different regions. So the questions of response and justice also require really consideration about local and regional factors. The marine sites on the World Heritage List are disproportionately affected by climate change and by an intersecting range of different impacts, including sea level rise, chemical changes, and coral bleaching. And importantly, these impacts are not only impacts on heritage values, they're impacts on the services that these sites are providing to people. And I think Her Royal Highness mentioned the report, which tells us that even some of the carbon storage that is provided by natural World Heritage sites is now being threatened as a result of climate change, reducing their own ability to help us counteract climate change. So the impacts are significant. They're already happening. They're growing, and this underlines the urgency of acting. And whilst the World Heritage Outlook is focused on what we call these natural sites, each one of these issues tells us a story of relevance to wider questions of culture. And behind the global statistics are dramatic local changes and local losses, and all World Heritage sites carry our heritage as peoples and what we hope to pass to future generations. So in every site, every natural site that has a climate impact, we can see that these impacts are also impacts on people and impacts on culture as much as they are on nature. So you cannot look, for instance, at this change in the country I'm speaking to you from here in Switzerland, something which we could match with a picture of every climate impacted World Heritage site and not see that the impacts on nature are an impact on national culture. They're an impact on local life in the mountains, whether it's farming, tourism, or the inspiration drawn from simply contemplating natural forces at work. Allow me to address the question of conflict, and there's a growing intersection with conflict. In 2020, IUCN launched its first flagship report on the state of nature in a changing world. And this shows us that climate and culture are at a nexus that can both exacerbate the risk of conflict or help to avoid it. Nature and natural resources affect conflict in many ways. And at ecosystem level, for instance, both land degradation and deterioration of aquatic ecosystems can both increase the risk of armed conflict. And there's an important and prominent, albeit somewhat contested branch of the literature that points to climate change already creating a driver of conflict. Conservation practice, therefore, increasingly needs to recognize that effective conservation and restoration of nature can contribute to mitigating and preempting armed conflict, but that if we take weak and unjust approaches to conservation, we will fuel conflict. And this underscores the importance of socially inclusive conservation that is community-centered and rights-based. Allow me, Chair, to conclude with 4 reflections on the nature-culture relationship and points for a way forward based on that analysis. The first is the importance to recognize that climate change is a cross-cutting issue for all sectors, societies, and regions across the globe, including for cultural and natural heritage. But despite its seriousness, integration of climate change into management plans and governance of heritage sites is still often marginalized and not fully mainstreamed into planning and investment processes. This needs to change and requires both new tools, but also capacity development, such as the leading work we're doing together with the founding support of Norway through the World Heritage Leadership Programme, which I know will be presented later in this event. More widely, it points to the need to study and to understand the way that risk drivers such as climate change are functioning, and to develop clearer strategies on the potential of heritage to intervene in reducing disaster risks and building peace. And in this regard, the event we're launching today and the work of ICCROM is greatly welcomed, including the defragmentation that you're engaging in across disaster risk and humanitarian and aid agencies. Secondly, the ongoing and future impacts of climate change and disasters on biodiversity and culture cannot and must not be seen in isolation, but rather addressed through comprehensive landscape and seascape scale approaches. We have to look beyond individual sites when thinking about and planning for adaptation and resilience. Changes in the surrounding environment beyond the defined boundaries of a community or an ecosystem can and will affect its conservation. And these changes can also impact all of the change that support a place and all of the practices that support a place, including driving the movement and the availability of communities, goods and services, with potentially damaging impacts on the economic returns that World Heritage Sites and heritage sites provide to support local communities. Thirdly, local communities and Indigenous peoples who play the key roles in safeguarding both biodiversity and cultural knowledge and practices will themselves be impacted and are being directly impacted by climate change. and must be central to solutions. Local communities and their rights must be given the central role in governance through all stages of adaptation planning. And this approach needs to be inclusive, empowering in a transparent, inclusive and empowering in a transparent manner, address gender, include youth, and the approaches need to address all of the societal challenges that are being faced, including threats to health and well-being, threats to local livelihoods, the degradation of crucial ecosystems and infrastructure. When we seek to safeguard biodiversity and culture, we must include in our adaptation approaches the people by whom and for whom this cultural and natural heritage is protected. And finally, Chair, nature-based solutions and heritage conservation can help build the resilience of both local biodiversity and cultural diversity. For example, nature-based solutions provide ecosystem benefits such as water and climate regulation and the continued provision of culturally significant food and materials. In addition, the traditional knowledge embedded in cultural heritage can help build resilience, contextualize ongoing climate change, and demonstrate sustainable alternatives and innovations. And heritage sites can also serve as climate change observatories to monitor impacts, to test practices, whilst also helping to raise awareness of the impacts of climate change. In closing, Chair, we urgently need, in the face of these challenges, transformative change in global and national climate policies, in financing, and in the action that's needed to break down silos and to mainstream climate change into heritage conservation and vice versa. So let me close and thank you for this opportunity to make the connection between nature and culture in facing this challenge. And I look forward to working together on the action that is now needed. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Badman, for your presentation. And my thanks to all the panelists for all of their contributions. We now have just a few minutes, about 10 minutes or so, for a short Q&A session. I have a few questions that I would like to ask you, and I've been sent some questions that have come in through the attendee hub. So I'm going to do my best to bring them all together and ask each of you a question. What you shared so far are the really profound examples of the impacts of climate change on culture and heritage and the consequences of those impacts, and then also the profound roles of culture and heritage in meeting the challenges of climate change. I noticed two themes, well, there are many themes, but there are two that I particularly want to draw out in our question and answer approach. And the first one is transformation. And the second is the bringing together of all of our parts for action. With respect to transformation, both Minister Kofe and Her Royal Highness particularly brought out the issue of transformation. Tuvalu, for example, is facing both physical transformations and envisioning transformations in its relationship and how they see themselves. So I wanted to frame a question for each of you that starts to tackle some of that issue of transformation, and then also the bringing together of our knowledge to help address it. Mr. Ottone, if I could start with directing a question to you. You mentioned, among all of the things that UNESCO is doing, the bringing together of the UNESCO Reflections Group, and particularly the recent meeting with the IPCC on culture, heritage, and climate change. And that's definitely a bringing together of different groups that have not been speaking together previously in this way. So I wanted to ask for your reflections on transformations or changes that you see in these conversations coming together, and if you have ideas or visions on what comes next.
Well, to be very frankly, as you mentioned, sorry, I have to do math. As you have mentioned, we had in the past a fracture between the scientific knowledge and the natural cultural knowledge, between the works that different organizations were doing on climate change. What we could discover is that at the field level, there is not such division. When you do the projects on the ground, there is no division between institutions, there was no division between local, national, regional level. All are getting together for for trying to give some answers to the communities. Because at the end, when we are talking about climate change, it's affecting for sure the sites, the managers, but the most important, they're affecting people, their livelihoods depend on the territory where they live. So I think that the reflection that we have been doing together, not only with ICCP, with e-commerce, for sure with IUCN for many years and ICCROM, is to understand that at the end of all preoccupation, there are a human-based approach that should be the focus, the main focus of what we are doing. And somehow we have been feeling that the scientific part of the revision of climate change has understand that at the end, it's not only on the preservation of the future in a global sense. It's really practical. How are we going to find solution? What I see is that today we have the possibility, as it was mentioned by the special rapporteurs, to work all together, all institutions, trying to send very clear messages, but at the same time, trying to find, by knowledge that we have been working and that it's accumulated, picks a real solution for communities that are struggling with adaptation and mitigation. So I really believe that this year we're going to have, as you know, with e-commerce and ICCP, the 3 white papers that are reflecting on major subjects that I mentioned before. We're going to have this flexible mechanism that we are working with Greece and many member states to focus also on climate change. And I believe that the updating of the document of World Heritage that has to be reviewed by the committee in Kazan will also help us to get a definitive point of view of all institutions on how we can all build back better, as you know, is one of the big quote of United Nations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Ottone. And you just hit on a point that I wanted to link to my question for Professor Xanthaki. Professor Xanthaki, you brought together the issues of migration and Indigenous peoples. And I have a particular question that's come in through the attendee hub that I want to try to work in here. Particularly wanted to ask if you have particular insights or examples on the intersection of heritage, culture and heritage, and migration. What are the impacts that are happening? And the question that I've been asked to forward on to you is, do you have any examples of actions that have been taken to address the impacts of climate change or migration on culture and heritage? Are there any that have come through to you in the work that you do?
Thank you, putting me on the spot here. I I'm going to revert to my friends for specific examples. My understanding is that, and also to let you know that, as I said, the first report to the General Assembly is going to be on development and cultural rights. The second, the next report to the Human Rights Council, so my third report, is going to be on people on the move and cultural rights. So if you ask me a year later, maybe I'm gonna my response is going to be different. However, what I do want to say is that it hasn't, the issue of migration, cultural migration and cultural rights in general has not been very much developed, and this is why we chose to make it a priority. And this is something that how cultures are affected in the receiving states, in the host states, is something that we still need to do a lot of work. There is work that is being done by civil society, and there are discussions. So, for example, only a couple of months ago, I was discussing with other scholars and indigenous communities the impact of climate change for indigenous women in specific, and the effects that migration has on them because of or when they migrate for environmental issues in general. I think that traditionally in the United Nations and in human rights, there was, and I think this is what other speakers mentioned as well, there has been a very clear route that dealt with economic rights and development and this impact and these aspects of rights. And then there was this root on identity and traditions and culture. And I think that it's very recent that we're trying to bring everything together. And if you looked at the migration discussions during the discussions for the global compacts, you wouldn't see a lot of discussion about the intersection of culture and migration, let alone the intersection of climate change, culture, and migration. So I guess this is something that we have to put a lot more work in, and this is what this is going to be a priority of my mandate.
Wonderful. There's definitely so much to bring together there. So definitely, I hope we can keep in touch and keep the conversation and the work going. Thank you.
Absolutely. And this is exactly my wish as well.
Fantastic. Mr. Badman, turning to you, and I also have an absolutely enormous question for you as well. You spoke to the connections of conservation and conflict, and particularly where they come together. And at the end of your presentation, you also noted the need for transformation in how we were bringing all of the pieces together. So my idea for a question is to ask you if you have particular ideas or visions, particularly on how we work with the modes of heritage and nature conservation to help address issues of conflict. Are there any particular examples or issues that you would like to add or that you could elaborate on?
Oh, goodness, yes, a huge question. And I have the answers to the last two questions in my head as well. I guess I've got, there were 3 points I had in my head, Marcy, listening to the discussion. I think the first is to really try to bring together a common idea of how we're speaking to the issues, because I think Ernesto Ottone's diagnosis is completely correct, and some of the challenges are, we have the diversity of impacts at local level, and then this sort of series of international approaches that we need to work through. So I think just finding a way to describe and make clear how the solutions that are needed need to be culture-centered, nature-based, just and inclusive, characteristics that need to be delivered everywhere. And the nature-based solution standard of IUCN has a series of connections to culture. I think the second, I really agree with Professor Xanthaki's defragmentation point. So many of the ways we don't respond effectively are because we're all trying to do the same thing, but do it, call it different things, fund it through different mechanisms, compete unhelpfully for attention, instead of seeing that the service, we're trying to provide a service at ground level. And I think my third comment, I'm not sure if any of these are quite answering your question, is to follow the money. So many cultural solutions are nature-based solutions, and we think nature-based solutions could provide 30% of the answer to climate change, but only 3% of the finance is being spent in this space. So how can we get a much more joined up approach, but also recognition that this is a place where the payback for investment will work.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, as you said, if we start to bring those pieces together and work on the financing, we may get to some of the effects that we hope to have, conflict and unrest. I'm very aware of the time, but I did want to turn finally to Dr. Mwangola again to bring us full loop on this opening panel. And for you, I have probably the biggest question of all. Your presentation was there is transformation is what I've been talking about, but what you did with your opening presentation is sort of actually transported us to a different place in space with all the different tools of music and story and place setting. So I think the question I wanted to just ask you is if, with this whole panel in mind, are there recommendations or just your reflections on the different tools that we have for transformation and really connecting and sharing with each other?
Thank you. And let me just say, it was such a great panel, just listening to everybody and all the different pieces. And as everybody, I think has been said, it's about all of us working together. I think what I wanted to do, and I hope came out, is how much often everyday ordinary people feel that it's too big. You know, all these big organizations are the ones working on this, all these professionals, all these policies that don't seem to be at that level. And I think for me, the Wangari Maathai quote, I may be insignificant, but there is still something I can do. For me, that's one part. Is first of all, for everybody to say, yes, there are these big organizations working on it, and just listening to what's going on in places like Tuvalu, you almost feel overwhelmed by, oh my goodness, how can I as one person or a small group of people do anything? And especially if there are any youth who are, following this panel, I think the important thing at the end, we try to end with this note of the next generation, to say, it's finding out how those connections, where do we fit in? As somebody has just said, yes, where's the money for us to do what we need to do? How are the cultural practitioners connecting to the people, the scientists? And that's the other reason why, again, for me, Wangari Maathai was always very important, because she was a professor, a scientist, but she still was able to connect with community professionals and ordinary people. So I think when I was thinking about it all and saying, how do all of these come together? I think for me, it is learning the lesson that we must work across boundaries of time. And so Gwatilo, whose poems I kept coming to as my through line, said to me, initially I was talking about the past, invocation from the past, the present, and the future. And she said, well, I don't see Wangari Maathai as from the past. So figuring out some things are timeless, but that doesn't mean we leave them behind. Connections between place. It was fascinating to hear how does what's happening in the Caribbean, we look at connect to what's happening in Tonga. How does that connect with what's happening in Africa or in Europe? So figuring out those connections. For me, the big one is figuring out how culture fits in at all of these places. And culture isn't just the arts. It isn't just, the cultural professionals who work in museums. It isn't just those who work in places like UNESCO. It's also, somebody like the Oloibon, who is a custodian that so many people follow and listen to. So I guess for me, the wonderful thing is, and I'm looking forward to this conference, is seeing how all these connections come together. And so that the next generation are able to say, we have a place, we are not insignificant, and we are going to make the difference working with all these big organizations. Thank you.
Dr. Mwangola, thank you so much. You've just brought it together so beautifully. I have so many more questions, more have come in, but we need to wrap up here. But I think this is where we say we have this coming week to talk and continue to explore all of the themes, and then far, far beyond that, I hope. With that, I'm going to say thank you again so much for all of your contributions to our wonderful distinguished panel. And Aparna, I will turn it back to you for our closing.
Thank you, Marcy. The insights our distinguished panelists have just shared with us from their own work clearly illustrate that climate change must be seen as a complex problem that has interconnected social, cultural, environmental, and economic underpinnings, thus making a case for working across boundaries and for integrating culture and heritage into wider policy, research, and action for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And also bringing the masses into it and bringing a human-centered approach to the larger effort of climate action. So with that, I would like to, for their invaluable contribution in launching this conference and expanding the scope of discussions, on behalf of ICCROM and consortium partners, I extend our sincere gratitude to the Honourable Minister, Mr. Simon Kofe, Minister for Justice, Communication and Foreign Affairs for Tuvalu, Her Royal Highness Princess Dana Firas, UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for Culture and the Chairperson of Petra National Trust in Jordan, His Excellency Mr. Ernesto Ottone, the Assistant Director General for Culture at UNESCO, Honourable Professors Alexandra Xanthaki, the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, and Honourable Mr. Tim Badman, Head of Culture, Heritage and Youth at IUCN, and of course, Dr. Mshaï Mwangola and Mr. George Babu Acheng. We thank you for giving us your time and for sharing these valuable insights with us. In the coming days, guided by 4 interconnected teams and a wide range of panels, discussions, keynotes, Ignite talks, and climate open mic sessions, we aim to discuss this idea further and develop a common agenda for heritage in climate action. And I take this opportunity to also thank Dr. Marcy Rockman, our scientific committee, and all the contributors, as well as the Climate.Culture.Peace team, interpreters, as well as IT support for their tireless efforts in bringing together this conference. For those of our attendees who continue to be with us, we will conclude this inaugural proceedings with a video on melting snow and rivers in flood, an ongoing project exploring a community-led response in Rwenzori and West Nile region of Uganda, where climate change risks the erasing of belief systems, cultural rights, and sacred sites alike. It is led by the International National Trust Organization in partnership with Cross-Cultural Foundation of Uganda and the National Trust of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So let's watch the video.
Emirimo mukulu nikitashamba neryo bangabyobola munga hanu mamashaba kuba tukitashamba tuyokonya kushikuwena obo mushya makola kuti utuhe tukakusaba utuhe maezi wangatokirikulia bana abakuluba malamu obwangane nakitashamba twangahumulikana kuba byabya hakeratu abatata bakina balere nalyalenga bali kumikayi ota hano bulambu buno abasokulu bo bulambu bwe baba bakakola mu mibiri tonga babiri leto mibiri ya bikushi yali kwa bana balere kundoka abashakulu bakatubere bakabuambu bwana matusala la mwa kukenana tubalere nabasokulu bakabwa akana iko mujungu narusha ekinyora nzoro unyitwa dinyetu esanzoro sika kuma musiku esanzoro balangerisha mabi yenya sikipeko bwambwetero moja mahika tuli mebyali yamana risiaje yamabyo.
Because of the melting glaciers, but also because of unpredictable rainfall, we found there's a lot of flooding in 2018 and 2019. Their belief system is greatly at risk. And we felt it's important not only to try and retrieve what is left, but also raise awareness about the intangible cultural heritage attached to some of these sites.
abasangwe babiri bobuhunga bwo kwamoko kolushi ebintu mu byasenda binene nerolusi lwamavitwala kavundu
hantu hari ishandekere neyo ekyenyisimisikuza kyamaleta mabu kyamaleta shangwangwa neri shamasa shama birebire shandekere shetu shebyahantu neri shamahwaho.
As someone born here in Rwenzori, I was surprised. We have so many cultural sites around us and people really respect them. We ask the people to work with us to see, first of all, how we can map, document, and make these sites known. Places of sacrifice, places of prayer. We were able to identify about 50 cultural sites, but most of them have been affected by the floods.
Our business is to care for heritage and make sure that it's safe, it's preserved, it's well known. So on the one hand, you have conservationists who are interested in biodiversity and climate change, global warming, concepts which are very foreign. And on the other hand, for different reasons, a community is contributing to those objectives by caring about their forests and making sure the water bodies are clean and they're not contaminated, because water is also considered sacred.
Arukango musula na vita na ukuru katsandaia. Tukase basanga sanga nitwa hano. Han.
Obisuru telwa boga. Kali atuwe treho. Amatseba mukaga.
Abushiyo mugaso. Kuba banenye nganale bya nomungu ile lyovhere. Aganale bya nomungu ile lichikuba. Anganale bya nomungu ile re beronda. Anganale bya nomungu eyukire maburi. Erinya byenda yetu.
Cross-Cultural Foundation of Uganda is trying to work with the cultural leaders and the elders within the community to make sure that we use cultural knowledge to see how we mitigate the effects of climate. They told us that there are special types of vegetation that you can plant near the river. They can be planted by the spiritual leaders, and when the river floods again, it doesn't go beyond that kind of vegetation.
Before Christianity, many communities believed that the ancestral spirits resided in the forest.
Abandu abakuru bakuru na balere balere okwa muwasu owemenye iringeyi.
I know.
The threat to heritage from climate change, it is a global phenomenon. I think the power of this project was to be able to look at both countries, very different countries, very far apart. I'm very fortunate to be the general manager for a World Heritage Site that has all sorts of protections and statutory designations. What the Ugandans helped us do was think about what was important to our community, not only the sort of grand Fountains Abbey, and a little example from the town just down the road from us called the Fairy Step. And those steps were converted during the First World War so that they could move tanks up the steps out of the river. They have no designation, they have no statutory protection, but taking that memory back to the First World War is really important for the community. So what we did was we adjusted our project, and that will protect that community value for the future. What we're doing is working at a landscape scale and working with the community, particularly our farming community, to do much more softer interventions, to slow the flow of the river, stop the erosion of silt and soil. And we found that is much more cost effective, but also is a way of spreading the message about climate change, that it is happening and it has an impact on the places that people love.
Most of these trees were underwater.
Yes, actually water was
around this area from that spot. For us, it was a matter of doing it like we are serving our people. Even people who are fishing here, when they look at what we are doing, they feel that something more is being done for them. Something small can do something big. This is my belief.
We have piled just stones which we have picked from the neighborhood, so it still allows the river to continue with this natural flow. This is quite a new concept to us that we learned about during our interaction with Fountain Abbey. We've also been able to train the communities in terms of flood management. The communities have defined ways that they want to run these sites and manage them sustainably.
Aya isadi mamua manaka yanction kanu ngwati mo pinne gicheke pinne gibegi nene wange ungo from epong ana winju magoro keto kwa bedo kwa chwalo ywak mamua wacho juma kene mabima ko chingwa gin muketo giluonge wang lei bedo pokre pa nyipir ko nyabongo lei magi keti kingi magi tongi kingi kuom echo bedo nia jopa nyipir ka unu bi ai kuyo tungre to chieng ubi loko duogo po duoko lweny
Fomo kwe la unjire diotin matine ni kabere matontong oruge chako chidokecha gilego lega matontong kokonyo aniang maber makwe enike political significance any
wati esuru matontong ipokrima na kejecha mirario wanglei any for historic reason ediko wasu ne okonyo yo megi spiritual e chalo lega kauna winjo ne akaji tungwange maleng rech makre mapol leito dano ko chui
ya pada su
fong papier godo ginde tay mungeri I got legene I got dobi kado upimere I country ga jambia iselebele ya tulema ino
ibango ngenia pa pecha tie endo kot maduong de samo ko meru ko pecha
wacho nia ipedi kukwach kwach ne de eni lembe shisheke makwash bimio malembe shisheke ini per kunya bongo gishoyo gina gishoyo gitung podishe eni kodu mwa luo wanyai kodu de neni
gitie jopanya bongo de gitie jopanya pir de tie eyo gitie weng gemaro
we are proud to be part of this heritage. It makes us feel excited. Even generations to come will come and see this and they will know this is where Alur started.
Awinjo.
The government actually is responsible for caring for both natural and man-made heritage. More needs to be done to make sure that the spaces that are affected by climate change are understood by communities but are also protected by the government.
Vanemulengesia erheremet. Vanemulengesia ertende tematema. You emete eyini okwachisharara. Neresisialengesia erheraho ebendebet ngemirong. Ebe kalenda echisharara ertende ndati birichibere.
Ikadi kindwani kumpimo airo njori wande wamade. Pimo ai kakae eribo kindwa weng. Ana winjire maber kadano shokre.
Thank you to all those who watched today's inaugural session. We hope this session has informed you and inspired you. The exploration and dialogue continues with our next session featuring Ignite Talks. What are the links between climate, culture, and peace? This session actually has already started in a different Zoom room. Please join the room using the following link or watch the live stream on ICCROM's YouTube channel. Simultaneous interpretation is also available in French and Arabic. In order to hear the session in another language, please click on the interpretation button in the meeting controls at the bottom of your Zoom window and select your desired language. I thank you all and goodbye for now. Thank you.